Also, for those back in your studios that couldn't be here, many of our sessions from yesterday are now up on Variety.com. So tweet back and email back, and I encourage people to view the sessions. I thought yesterday's sessions were great. Today I'm really excited about, especially with Gabe keynoting this morning. Gabe doesn't speak in a lot of places. He's a visionary in the industry, as you guys all know. Great game maker, has disrupted the market with Steam. There will be a lot of things coming from Valve that I think are of great interest to us. And I'm also proud to say he's this year's inductee, newest inductee into the Academy's Hall of Fame. So I'm going to get off so we can hear Gabe, and this is being live streamed out, so lots of people will be watching. So please welcome Gabe Newell. Thank you.
Hello. So I'm going to try to avoid being salesy today. I'm not going to announce any products. And what I'm really going to try to do is talk about the structural changes that we see going forward and that's going to affect all of us in our industry. I have two main theses in this talk. The first is that I think the PC ecosystem is going to expand into the living room, which we've been talking a little bit about. And the other is that we think there's going to be a fairly significant sea change in how we all think of what a game is. And that nature of the video game industry is going to change so that all the games end up being part of a connected economy. And that economy is about building and exchanging digital goods and services. Which sounds like a really weird way to talk about video games, but over the course of this presentation, hopefully I can help motivate why we've reached that point in our own thinking. So why the PC? Right? Traditionally, people say nobody wants a PC in the living room. Well, if you look back over the last decade plus in our industry, the PC really has been the center of innovation in video games, whether it's MMOs or social gaming, free-to-play, 3D graphics hardware. It's really come out of the open competition that's possible when you have things like the PC and the internet. Now, there's been one exception to that. One area where the PC hasn't been leading is on input. And I'm sort of curious about why that would be and how Valve can help contribute to that. But that's sort of the noticeable exception, whether you're talking about multi-touch on the iPad or you're talking about the Wii originating motion input. That seems to be something that the PC has struggled with. One of the great things about the PC is that it's a great development environment for programmers and for development teams. So the marginal cost of having a PC game in the living room is a lot smaller than developing for an entirely new platform. The other thing on the same side of it is that increasingly, as the internet has become more embedded in consumers' lives, they have huge media libraries. They have social networking services. They are making more and more of an investment in that part of their lives. And if the PC expands into the living room, iTunes just works, Hulu just works, Twitter just works, Facebook just works. All of these investments that people have made and all of these services that have developed are just going to continue to work. And what's also important is it's not just what we have today, but there's no evidence at all that the innovation is slowing down, that we won't see more and more services coming out on the internet. And the PC will be able to pick those things up very easily over the course of the next 5 to 8 years. You don't have to say, oh my God, how are we going to get that application running on our dedicated hardware in the living room? One thing I think when we've been talking to people, we've been sort of cheerleading this movement, is a lot of people have this outdated notion of what is possible with the PC. And I think it's important to stress that the movement towards mobility has forced PC component vendors to go way beyond the requirements of the living room. When you're looking at thermal envelopes, power, noise, all of these different things, the fact that the silicon vendors in the PC space are worrying about the encroachment of smartphones and tablets has meant that they've gone way beyond anything that we would require as far as a living room platform. Nowadays, making small, quiet, cool PCs is a well-solved problem by multiple vendors. Now, what's this going to look like? So we think there's actually going to be a segmentation. There's sort of a good, better, best segmentation that will occur in the living room. And the good, better, best will relate directly to both pricing and functionality. So the good is, I think there's a lot of evidence at CES of this year, is in-home streaming. And if you're kind of looking for a conceptual model of that, think of it as like your PC now has an extra monitor and an extra set of inputs. It's like extending HDMI to work inside of your home. The user interface for that is sort of the tricky part, and thinking through user integration, or the integration of the user experience is kind of the hard thing. Like, how can I make that so you're not pairing devices or worrying about configuration, that the discoverability, and it just sort of happens automatically for the customer. The good news about it is that that's going to start at about $100 and eventually go down to $0. So this will just become a standard feature of every television. And so if you want to be playing games in your living room, your PC somewhere else in your home is actually doing the heavy lifting. The latency is basically non-existent. So we really believe that it's a very low-cost pathway and also a high-quality path. There's still some issues left. So when we're talking to people about that, there's some holes in their story in terms of how do they do audio synchronization and what's the input model so that I can be holding a game controller and getting that signal back to the originating PC. The great news, though, is that the price point that's going to be hit is going to be much, much lower than things we've traditionally seen in living room devices. Better is basically a PC in the console form factor and at the console price point. There's nothing really magical about the hardware. This is sort of the great thing about the PC, is that it's been evolving so quickly that just the massive capital expenditure that's gone into PCs over the last few years, the sheer number of units, the price performance of the PC means that we as a gaming industry can leverage off of that and take advantage of that. And the funny thing is, when you sort of sit down and do this analysis, is not that you're worried about, okay, what's going to happen on the console side. It's actually scarier to think what Apple's going to do. Apple has this huge unit advantage. Smartphones and tablets are really getting into these huge numbers, and Apple has a much more sort of natural progression into the living room with sort of fundamentally industry-to-industry competitive advantages that I think are more threatening to the PC moving into the living room than anything that would be happening on the console side. Another great thing that Apple does is they have a much less lumpy upgrade cycle. So rather than saying to consumers and to developers, throw everything away and start over, they have a much smoother pathway from iPhone 1, iPhone 2, and same on the iPads. And I think that is beneficial both to consumers and developers, and is a challenge for us in the gaming industry. Best, it's pretty straightforward. PCs have always scaled really well. If a customer wants more 3D performance, they can get it. They want more storage for video, they can get it. Just sort of across the board. They want a faster connection. All those things work very well. So, the sky's the limit. If you want a $4,000 living room box, I'm sure there are lots of PC vendors who are going to send that to you. If we solve the other problems in terms of making it a great user experience, there's certainly going to be a lot of hardware out there to satisfy any consumer's high-end desires. Important thing is that each of these things are not really competitive. They're all complementary. So a user who has a great experience using in-home streaming is going to be much more likely to upgrade to a PC in a console form factor and then continue to invest, because all of those investments are going to stay with them in perpetuity. And the plausibility of saying, wow, this high-end PC is 10 times the fastest console is going to give credibility to the long-term performance and quality of the PC gaming experience. Now, one question I get asked a lot is, what's the difference between cloud gaming and this in-home streaming thing? So you heard me talk about the in-home streaming as being more like a monitor. The cloud gaming stuff I have been and continue to be a skeptic about, and I thought it might be useful to explain why that would be. So, I mean, there's nothing special about gaming as it's just an instance of a class of distributed applications. And how do you distribute functionality around a network is one of the oldest problems in computer science. You know, and whenever you look at this analysis, there's always like, let's ignore the fact that you have this network cost, and cloud gaming works until it starts to be successful, at which point it falls over from its own success. All the spreadsheets sort of involve ignoring the provisioning levels that consumer network operators use. And so as soon as everybody starts using a continuous network connection in order to get their applications, consumer IP pricing is going to go through the roof. And one of the points I would make is, even if you started out, let's say our industry had never done consoles or consumer clients, even if you'd started out with cloud gaming, you'd actually go in the direction of pushing intelligence out to the edge of the network, simply because it's a great way of caching and saving you on network resources. So even if we had started with cloud gaming, we'd end up with smart clients at the ends of networks. Another point is cloud gaming puts latency compensation in the wrong place. It puts it at the center of the network rather than at the edge. And one thing we believe is that latency sensitivity is actually going to increase in the future. The ability to do local high-speed processing will become more important than it is right now. Right now, people think of it in terms of, you know, the customer experiencing lag during play. We actually think there's going to be a bunch of hardware in the future where that you have even more sensitivity than a human does to latency, and that putting that functionality at the center of the network will actually be impossible. And the last point I'd make is, if you really do want a thin client, there are better approaches than using video, which is the typical system being used. If you really just want to, you know, have a standard client out there that, you know, that's not a full-blown game engine, there are much better approaches than sending video. So I think there's a place for cloud gaming, but it much more of as a feature for things like demos and spectation, and not as a core architecture for delivering value to consumers. I'm going to switch gears a little bit. You know, the first part was trying to explain why we think the PC is important and how it's going to segment. Now I'm going to talk about how we see the games themselves evolving. When we started Valve in 1996, we kind of needed some way of thinking about our decision making, like what's a good game, what's a better game, like how do we decide, you know, where to invest our development resources. We came up with this model that served us really well for Half-Life and Half-Life 2, which was, think of the ways that the game is responding to player action and player state. So, you know, putting decals when you shoot a wall was going to be more fun than shooting a wall and having the wall ignore you. So we just tried to come up with this conceptual model. And then in Half-Life 2, we did all this work to make sure that when people were looking at you, they were actually properly looking at you in three-dimensional space, so the eyes are oriented. It's the same way that when I'm up here, people in the audience can tell whether I'm looking at the second row or the third row. And we use that sort of rule of thumb of being, you know, of responding to player actions and states. It was a great guideline for us in making our decisions. The problem was it totally broke down when we were doing multiplayer games. So the example, you know, that I use is on Counter-Strike. You know, the value of the game was so much of the other people in the game, and since we don't have control of them, how can we apply this heuristic that we were using in single-player games? And we have weird behaviors, like we put the riot shield into Counter-Strike, and the player numbers go up, which we used as our, you know, indicator of whether or not we were being successful. And then we took the riot shield out of Counter-Strike, and the player numbers go up, right? And all of a sudden we have to have a way of thinking about multiplayer games that explains that kind of phenomenon. So we started to evolve this notion, you know, our version of entertainment as a service. And then we use that to make decisions about, you know, Steam and how we thought about matchmaking, how we thought about game design, and so on. So, you know, we had a great story for how to think about single-player games. It broke down when we moved to multiplayer. So we developed a new way of thinking about multiplayer. And, you know, a lot of that helped motivate our original decision to do Steam in the first place. But now we think that we're going through yet another breakdown in Valve's way of thinking about what a game is, how we can make good decisions to create better game experiences. And it's really driven by a series of innovations that are occurring both on the PC and on the internet. So an example are auction houses. You know, you have these auction houses appearing and people are exchanging these goods, and you know, you look at the sort of the real dollar value of that, it's like, oh my God, that person just spent the equivalent of $2,000 to better equip their characters. And these marketplaces are proliferating. Free to play is another example. You know, if you had asked me that if a long time ago, oh, we'll give away our games for free, I'd say, I don't understand that scenario at all. It's like, haven't you just, you know, killed your business? And the idea that a marginal audience member was worth more than the marginal cost of provisioning that service would have seemed super speculative to me. But what we've seen pretty consistently is that when something moves from, you know, traditional monetization model to free to play, you see about a 10x increase in your audience and about a 3x increase in your gross revenue. And depending upon your costs, that can be a really big improvement in your business. So we've seen that happen multiple times. There's also been an explosion of user-generated content. You know, and it's, you know, there's some games that have this notion of user-generated content, but in TF2, just to be really clear, the community itself makes 10 times as much content as we do. So we're kind of a egotistical, vain company, and we tend to think we're really good at competing with people on content production, right? It's like us, and if anybody hears from Bungie, it's like, oh, we're better than you at making content than Bungie, or anybody else in the industry. So it's, you know, it may not be true, but you know, we're sort of willing to believe that we can compete with them. We can't compete with our own customers. Our customers have defeated us, like not by a little, but by a lot. So, you know, I just want to be clear. It's not like, oh, look, it's cute. You put an antler on your, you know, your dog in a game. It's like they're building content that's just as good or better than what we're building, and they're building it at, you know, at a spectacular rate. And once we take that user-generated content and say, oh, okay, well, let's start letting these people sell it to each other. So we have people who are making $500,000 a year selling content in the workshop, right? Which, you know, is pretty good. I would, lots of years, I would have been super excited to make $500,000. So the fact that, you know, this exchange of goods, user-generated goods, is starting to be at that volume forces us to think, you know, how should we be thinking about what a game is? So we start finding people are creating currencies. So all of a sudden, there are these Mac earbuds or keys in our games, and our customers start using them as a currency, right? And then we see weird things like there's a liquidity crisis, right? You know, we have this little mini financial crisis in the middle of our game because for some reason people are hoarding, you know, the unit of exchange, you know, and in some places in the world, we started to have to do the equivalent of W-4s, right? We have regulatory compliance. You know, it's like, oh, this is, you know, income, and you have to report it. And then we have balance of trade. You know, who would have thought that when we started to connect some of these games together that, oh, you know, where there's an imbalance of trade, and it's like, what is an imbalance of trade in virtual goods that can be manufactured, you know, with a marginal cost basically of zero. So all of these things seemed at first to be somewhat disconnected from each other, but they were making us think that our model for thinking about what we were doing that should be guiding our future decisions needed some revision. So the way that we're currently thinking about it is that games really are part of a large economy, and they're productivity platforms for goods and services. Super weird way of thinking about a game. It's like, how do you think of, you know, something in the Half-Life family or Porter family as a productivity platform? But what I think we see is that in the past, people spend huge amounts of time in these games, like hundreds of hours, you know, or 20 hours a week. And you know, they work at this and they get better at it and they accumulate these goods, and at the end of the day, when they go to another game, all that's thrown away. It's like, hey, you can buy a house, and as soon as you move out, you get no money for it and we burn it down. When you put it that way, it seems sort of weird. And so we think that each game should be thought of in terms of maximizing the productivity of users and creating and exchanging these goods and services. These goods and services need to have persistence, right? In other words, if I make an investment of my time, I can't destroy that investment without there being obvious negative consequences in terms of the value that people have in that experience. And the value of these things need to have a wide domain. In other words, economies get better the bigger they are, right? So if you have an economy and it's not connected to other economies and there's no trade and there's no way to exchange goods or services in Dota 2 for goods and services in Skyrim, it's a global failure. Another way of saying it, I played a lot of MMOs. If you're an MMO person, it's saying that all games are going to turn into instance dungeons of a central economy, right? So you go off into these experiences, but you always have this notion that what you're doing is valuable and exchangeable with other people who are participating. So there's some things that are fairly obvious, like in the Steam Workshop, you can build assets like a hat, or you can animate and make a taunt. Now we're adding music and other kinds of things. But we actually see that the logic of this way of thinking about what games need to evolve into leads us to realize that other things should be goods and services. Like a championship is a service. Friends are a service. A store actually should be user-generated content, right? So I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. So if we're right about this way of thinking, it leads us to some, you take a couple steps and you say, well, what this seems to mean is that Photoshop should be a free-to-play game, right? In other words, that there's not really a difference between very traditional applications and how they enhance productivity and wandering around in a forest, killing bears and accumulating leather. That these are in fact very related, and that we would say to people who have traditionally they charge us $10,000 a seat for 3D animating, 3D modeling or animating package, and we would say to them, what we think is that you should be a free-to-play app and that you should share in the revenue streams that are being generated by gamers who are using it. That you should think of a 3D modeling package almost like an RPG, where you start off and the first thing you have to do is create a box, and then you build more and more complicated things, and eventually you're level capped and you work for J.J. Abrams. But the whole point is, just thinking of how games and these productivity tools actually are different expressions of the same underlying economy and give gamers different ways of contributing to that overall economy. It also means that our role as game developers or as people who create frameworks is to think of them in terms of increasing the opportunities people have of contributing to that economy. Like professional players, one of the challenges the Dota 2 team really took on was how can we take the professional play of teams like IG or Navi and view it as a good where we have to think about how to help those teams monetize. So when you have virtual goods with no production, you have to think about what scarcity actually means. So the idea that Dendi on Navi can sign an item, it looks like the same item except for the fact that everybody believes that really was the item he used when he was playing in the International 1 and won the game. So this notion of how do you tackle that problem of, we know they're creating value, we can watch them play, and we know it's there, but what is missing from the framework, right? What are the container ships? What's the power grid that are going to let people be productive in these environments? Continuing to look at the problem of professional play, we say, how about banners, where a banner represents affiliation and everybody can see who is supporting which team during play, and a percentage of that revenue goes to the team, and there's also random drops that are given to players while they're showing their banner. That to us is like the kind of experiment we want to run that's a logical consequence of what we're doing. Think about what people are doing and then try to create frameworks that allow them to do it better. So within this, way of thinking about stuff, like what we've already tried to do, take some steps in the direction of helping the PC ecosystem expand into the living room and rethinking what it means to create a game or a gaming platform. So Steam itself continues to grow. It's a great time to be a PC developer, and we're working hard to address partner issues and gamer issues, and everybody gives us tons of useful feedback on how to make that better, and we're just going to keep on doing it. Another thing we did was big picture. We felt that it was easier to preserve software developers and customers' investments in the PC and get that into the living room to solve the sort of integration and usability issues than was sort of the traditional notion of how hard that would be. We feel that we've done a pretty good job of showing both customers and software developers, you can keep that huge investment you've made in the PC, and with only a little bit of extra work, you can also capitalize on that in the living room. One of the things we've also done is we've shipped support for Linux, and this is something that we're going to continue to expand on and work with partners on to make sure that we have the freedom to innovate and pursue all of the kinds of opportunities that each of us see. And Linux is sort of a kind of a get-out-of-jail-free pass for our industry if we need it. Now, but what are we doing, right? So given the concepts that I've expressed, what is it that we are going to do next, right? So that's great, you did Linux, but where are you going? And I think it helps to illustrate, if you know the steps that we're doing, maybe it'll help you understand what I was describing earlier. One thing we're doing is we're working on input hardware. We think that that's a big hole. We think we can, by sort of thinking about both the game side and the input hardware side at the same time, we can come up with solutions. We don't want to sell a bunch of hardware. Our goal is to move things forward because we're really dependent upon the success and vibrancy of the PC. We'll sell hardware if we have to, but the real challenge is to sort of think through these issues on input hardware. Right now, you've got multi-touch, you've got motion, you've got keyboard and mouse, and you've got game controllers, and we're trying to think of, if you have all of those things, how do you segment what things are good at some stuff and not so good at others, and how each of those individual pieces, if you're trying to do the whole thing holistically, how each of them should change. Like, if you have the option of having X, what does that mean in terms of how you should be doing controller design? Another thing we're doing right now is we're working with the different good vendors, the in-home streaming vendors. The Miracast initiative on the TV side, there's NVIDIA's Shield. There are lots of people who are working on it, but they do require us to do some work in order to make sure that the customer experience is seamless, right? It's easy to do a demo. It's a lot harder to get something where a customer, has it in home and has a really satisfying experience. So we're going to continue to work there. We're developing console form factor PCs, and we're working with partners on that as well. It's a very doable problem right now to build something that a consumer looks at and says, that has all of the characteristics of a great console device while taking advantage of the price performance and openness of the PC. Now, one thing we also have to do is this notion of authorship and ownership has to be much more integrated. So the way that we see things happening already is somebody builds one asset and somebody else builds assets on top of that, and then somebody else builds assets on top of that. So you have a model, you have a texture and a model and a world. And how revenue then flows between all of the participants so that everybody has confidence that as they invest in the community, that the community can reward them. That's sort of a deep problem where you have to make sure that is integrated well into the underlying framework. Another thing is that we came to the conclusion that if we really think user-generated content is right, if users can do a much better job of generating items in our games than we can, then we need to think about other ways that that could happen. So it's a really concrete example that sort of, for a lot of people, sort of brings the point home is that stores really should be user-generated content. In other words, you know, it used to be you build a game and the game was like privileged content, it was magic, and you know, the idea that a user would do it, they'd immediately go to porn and you know, like, no, we can't let users do that. It's a horrible disruption in the experience that we're crafting. And now on the other side, we're like, oh my God, they do a better job than we do. And it's all about enabling that productivity and enabling that engagement. Well, the same thing is true for a store, right? A store is just a collection of content. And if you look at the Steam store, you know, it's kind of this, you know, very safe, very conservative kind of well, it's a really boring entertainment experience. You know, it's like nobody says, oh, I'm going to go play the Steam store now. But that's what it should be, right? It's like anybody should be able to go in. You know, we'll have a store, but other people will be creating their versions of stores that will sit on the front end. And for each community or for each, you know, editorial perspective, they'll do a great job of taking all of the content and experiences that we're creating and presenting that to an audience. So in the same way that, you know, a model is a piece of user-generated content, a store should be a piece of user-generated content. Another thing that we're trying to do as a result of this kind of thinking is to say, okay, right now there's like, you have to call us up and say, hey, I want to get my game or my application running on Steam. And then people say, oh my God, we have so many submissions this week. You know, it's like this, we're this bottleneck on this system. There's nothing when you think about, you know, the direction that our industry is going that says we should have any sort of curation at all in our stores, right? Consumers should pull content through distribution frameworks, but this notion that somebody is acting as sort of a global gatekeeper is sort of a pre-internet way of thinking of that. So we're in the process of saying, okay, so what's the right way, given how you build these kinds of large distributed frameworks, what's the right way to think about the distribution part of Steam? You know, and you need to worry about stuff like, you know, viruses and, you know, people, you know, trying to publish other people's content and stuff like that. But the underlying thing is to sort of eliminate that whole barrier between people who create stuff and people who want to have access to it, and not have any sort of editorial or curation process in front of that. And you know, the equivalent on the game design side is not just thinking about the experiences we're giving people, but also think about the frameworks that we're giving to users for generating those things. And looking, excuse me, looking across all of the ways in which people are doing valuable stuff already, which maybe don't have an explicit distribution path or monetization path, and saying that's the challenge. If people are doing something valuable, but there's no way for the community to reward them, then there's an opportunity to improve our framework. You know, an example is other users as quest givers, right? Why can't I give a quest which is go kill my brother 20 times to, you know, some random person I meet on the internet? Or, you know, prediction markets is something that I personally am working on right now. You know, that's an interesting framework for a whole bunch of stuff, because we think that actually, given the nature of prediction markets, they're fun, they're entertaining to a broader audience, and there's actually a lot of information discovery that we can do. You know, and that's just like so far away from thinking about, you know, what's the next weapon we're going to add to a single player experience. So I'll come back to a question. It's like, why are we doing this? You know, it's sort of the same reason we did Steam. You know, we're really dependent on this vibrant, open community and development world, you know, to be successful for the long run. Our company wouldn't exist if it weren't for the openness of the PC. You know, Steam wouldn't exist if it weren't for the openness of the internet. And you know, so we see, you know, giving back to that as being a super important thing. You know, we want and think our industry is going to be best in the long run if there's this open platform for innovation and competition. Another thing is you know, a lot of this is about trying to get away from these really disruptive transitions, console transitions, where everything that customers and software developers invest in gets, you know, rebooted, you know, and then we all have to start over. I mean, I don't think there's a whole lot of value to that anymore, given modern software development and networking. I also think it's a lot lower risk. Like when we look at this sort of world, for us, being able to measure stuff, being able to do stuff incrementally, being as closely connected to our customers as possible, those are all things which have been critical to our success. So that's pretty much the end of my talk. I mean, I really am just saying this is how we think, this is what's motivating our decisions. You know, we're kind of, you know, I don't know how not to talk our book because it's, you know, it's how we think about stuff and it really does tend to drive our thinking. Hopefully, though, it's been informative and interesting to you. And if we're wrong, at least it will be spectacularly entertaining as a failure. So, thank you very much.